Thanks, Jen. Thanks as always to Sloat for hosting. We love these webinars and the topics that you're diving into this season of webinars is really exciting. So happy to be part of it. Thanks everyone for being here tonight. Tonight we are going to go through slides for probably a little bit more than 45 minutes, maybe about an hour. We'll talk, of course, about the Our Water, Our World program, a little intro to integrated pest management. If you've been with us before, it'll be a little bit of a repeat. We're going to talk about pests, the big picture about pests, but most of what we're going to talk about today is individual pests. So we have our list of pests that we'll cover today: snails and slugs, earwigs, citrus and vegetable leaf miner, thrips, spider mites, cabbage looper, some beetles, mosquitoes, fungus gnats, fungal diseases, rats, gophers, and other critters. And we will talk about a couple of invasive pests to look out for. And then, of course, we will leave you with some additional resources at the end. So first, as always, what is the Our Water, Our World program? We are sponsored today by Marin Clean Water Program. I forgot the full name. I apologize. The Contra Costa Clean Water Program and the San Francisco Public Utilities Commission. Our Water, Our World is a partnership with water agencies and retailers like Sloat, designed to bring awareness between pesticides and water quality and provide pest problem-solving education. You can find Our Water, Our World materials in over 200 hardware stores and nurseries in almost across California. We're kind of expanding statewide. And in most stores, what you'll find is a rack of fact sheets like the picture on the right. Also, many stores have a QR code poster, so you could just scan with your phone and get the same fact sheet information on your phone. And many stores also have these blue tags that highlight the eco-friendly products on the shelf. And then also you can access pretty much all this information at the website ourwaterourworld.org, where we have all the fact sheet information, lists of less toxic products, more information about using less toxic products, and a map of all of the stores that partner with the program. So as I mentioned, we're mainly a water quality, water pollution prevention program. So what does that have to do with pesticides? Well, we live in, if you live in the Bay Area, you live in the San Francisco Bay watershed. We all live in a watershed, which is an area that drains into a single body of water. We all live in many different watersheds, actually very tiny ones. Even our yards can be a watershed. And then, of course, the bigger one, the San Francisco Bay watershed that drains into the bay. The San Francisco Bay watershed is massive. Half of all water that falls on the state of California, either in rain or snow, does drain into the San Francisco Bay. Takes along with it any pollutants that got into, onto the street, into our yards, litter, debris, pet waste, motor oil, all of those things go down the drain, the storm drain at the street level. And then from that storm drain, it goes directly to the nearest waterway, creek, river, bay, or ocean, without any filtration. So again, everything we're doing out in the yard, in the street, has a direct line to waterways, because it drains through the storm drain directly into a waterway. So what we want to do is think about how we're affecting the waterways with that direct line, and things we can do in our gardens, in our homes, to reduce those pollutants. And one thing we can do is, when we're dealing with pests, is think about our pest management in a little different way. We call it integrated pest management, and that's what we teach here, or IPM. Integrated pest management is a decision-making process, and we base our decisions on science-based strategies. And it's really a holistic view of pest management. It's looking at the garden or home as a whole, and we ask a lot of questions. Usually when we see a pest problem, it's there for a specific reason. So we want to know what that reason is. So we ask, what is the problem at hand? The pest might not be the actual problem, it's just a symptom of the problem. So figuring out why that pest is there, and then understanding our thresholds. Can we live with it? A couple of aphids on a plant is not really anything to worry about, but certain problems, get get bigger, and then we might have to take some action to deal with them. So what is our threshold? Can we live with it, let it do its thing, monitor it, or do we need to take action? In integrated pest management, we have our few steps. Identification, always we're identifying, is it a pest problem or is it something else like an abiotic disorder? And that means something like in the environment, so watering or a nutrient issue or something to do with the weather. A lot of times those two things, pests or diseases and like a weather related problem, can look very similar. So we want to identify, is it a pest or is it something else? And if it is a pest, we want to know exactly what it is. Like if it's a bug, we don't want to know exactly what it is, because lots of pests look very, or lots of bugs look very different. Some are beneficial, some are not, and we won't be able to deal with it and take proper action if we don't know what we're looking at. Prevention is always the first step as well. There's a lot of things we can do before pests arrive. Mostly just taking really good care of our gardens. Choosing the right plants and taking good care of our gardens will prevent a lot of pest issues. Then we have our action steps. Once we've identified the pest, we are going to take some action steps. Cultural controls, very similar to prevention, bolstering the health of the garden, changing the environment of the garden to be really beneficial for your plants and less beneficial for pests. Pests like stressed out plants. So if we keep our plants not stressed, then there will be fewer pests. Then we have mechanical controls, traps, barriers, and tools, physical things we can use in the garden and the home to prevent and manage pests. Biological controls, which would be supporting the beneficial insects and other organisms in the garden that can help manage pests for us and keep populations low. And then lastly, we have our chemical controls, always as a last resort. Those are our pesticides, always as a last resort. Some people choose not to use them at all, and that is perfectly fine. We're always going to use the less toxic option and spray very carefully. Now as we talk about pests today, we're going to talk about these different action steps for each pest. So you'll have options for each one. And as I mentioned, of course, identification is really key in IPM. We want to identify the pest. We want to understand its life cycle. Maybe it has a very short life cycle, so it's not going to cause a lot of damage. Or maybe we need, when in the larval stage, it's going to be easier to manage. So we're going to take action then, or wait till the adult stage. We're going to understand the habitat and timing, when it's going to show up, where it's going to be. And are there any natural enemies present? Those beneficial insects, birds, lizards, other things, are they going to be in the garden? We're talking about pest habitat and timing. Caterpillars look very similar. There's lots of, colored striped black and yellow and green. They look very similar. But one great way to identify the caterpillar, is it going to be, something you want in the garden or something you need to deal with, is by identifying what plant it's on. Most caterpillars are pretty much host specific, so they only really eat the leaves of a specific plant. So if you know the plant, you can look up common caterpillars or caterpillars for that plant. So on the left is a monarch butterfly. They are like milkweed, milkweed, and then then there's the white-lined sphinx caterpillar. Looks very similar, but generally is more attracted to fuchsias. So again, we can look at the plant to help identify. That's how the pest habitat will help with that, and we'll know where to expect them. Some more pest or pal comparisons. Here we have on the left, we have the mealybug destroyer, which is considered a good bug because it feeds on mealybugs, which is a common pest. Very similar on the right, we have the flea beetle, which we'll talk about today, that feeds on the foliage of seedlings and leafy greens, mostly considered a bad bug and a pest, and we'll talk about how to deal with it. Another one, we see these lumps on the left on the leaf, and then on the right on the stems. Looks very similar, but that one on the left is a ladybug pupa. So it's going to turn into a ladybug. And then on the right is soft scale. So it looks similar. It's actually on the same tree. We received these photos from someone who was watching a webinar. Same tree, similar looking insect, but very different, of course. Here's an example of not even two different insects, two different pests altogether. So if you see these curly leaves on your fruit tree in the spring, before we take action, we're going to figure out what it is. The one on the upper right is curled leaves due to aphids. And this also, yeah, actually, let me keep going. And then this lower one is peach leaf curl, which is a fungal disease. Now, one way to us understand the difference, of course, if you see aphids, especially in the inside curled leaf, then it's likely aphids. Also, peach leaf curl only affects peaches and nectarines. So if you're seeing that leaf curl on an apricot or an apple or some other kind of tree, then it's definitely not peach leaf curl. It's likely aphids or another insect, and you're going to have to inspect the leaves to see if you can figure out what it is. So, and we would take care of these two very different ways. We'd use an insecticide or other cultural controls to manage aphids, and we would probably use a fungicide to manage the peach leaf curl.
Okay, so hopefully the takeaway from what Charlotte has already mentioned is that sometimes it's not easy to identify the pest, but if we know the host, if we know what the plant is, from there we can use the University of California statewide IPM website to help us identify what pests affect that plant. We can also go to the Our Water, Our World website to learn about some pest management tips. We can also go to garden centers like the Sloat Garden Center to ask associates there what kind of pests might be affecting my plant at this time. And when you notice a pest problem, typically, hopefully it's not as extreme as the aphids on this rose, which I absolutely love this picture. But I just want to share is oftentimes we don't notice the pest problems until it's pretty extreme. We're busy, we're not in our gardens as often as we like, or something has just gotten out of hand and boy, okay, now we need to take action. And a lot of times going through those preventatives steps isn't going to help because the problem is already right there. So a couple of things we want to share is then, yes, sometimes we do have to jump ahead to that chemical control, which we are going to discuss at length throughout the program. However, some things we want to share is that many pests are host specific. Okay, we've said that a couple times already. So some pests, aphids, we know they're coming. This is just a pest that happens to be seasonal. We're going to see aphids every spring. But we want to understand that, what is the threshold when we have aphids to this extreme? Then this is going to definitely be an indicator that the plant is stressed out. Maybe that plant is not planted in the right place. Maybe the soil health is very poor. Maybe the irrigation is incorrect. Maybe there is not a nice layer of mulch to support it. Maybe it is not being fertilized with organic fertilizers, maybe too many synthetic fertilizers, which is going to stress out the plant and cause an excessive population of aphids. And then something else to consider is lack of predators. So when we, it's really important, and I'll get into this a little bit more, to always plant other flowering plants that are going to attract beneficial insects, attract the pollinators, really to encourage a nice biodiversity throughout the ecology of the garden. These are going to be your insurance to help keep that balance of good bugs and bad bugs. And understanding that, let's go. Next slide, please. Yeah, so that some pests are seasonal and to be expected, such as the aphids, but pests are food for the beneficial insects, which help keep a healthy balance in the garden. So if we don't have aphids, then there's not going to be any food for our beneficial insects to eat. So we might think, we have a couple aphids on the rose, Oh my gosh, I have to go down and get some ladybugs and bring them home. And oh my gosh, all the ladybugs have flown away. This is a disaster. But a few aphids is not that much food. There's a lot of ladybugs there. They're hungry. They're looking for food. They want to know that there's enough food for their young to thrive also. So that's why, of course, the photo before with all of those aphids on that rose is maybe an extreme, but it's also reality for some of us. But what we want to do is the picture here where there's just a few aphids on the Asclepias, that butterfly milkweed, and we have a ladybug larvae enjoying that, a snack of some aphids. And this is actually nice. We want to see that. But also understand that in an infestation of a pest can also be a clue that something isn't working. And we always want to kind of address that cause. So if we were looking back at that rose, okay, we'll manage those aphids, wipe them off or syringe them with some water in a water bottle. But then we really want to look at like what's going on. Okay, I haven't been fertilizing it properly. That soil is totally, lacking in soil nutrients. I'm not irrigating it properly. So that's where we would go through all those cultural controls, those preventative tactics to then adjust the situation, increase the health of that plant, and then we will see less pest problems. So let's dive in. I did take some notes and I wanted to share some things, but I think that, let's just dive in. So slugs and snails, I will share that many of us right now, I'm going to guess that many of us right now are seeing an abundance of slugs and snails. Mainly because we've been getting a lot of rain. It's nice and cool and moist. And boy, let me tell you, that's what slugs and snails love. When we want to reduce slugs and snails, we want to reduce their hiding places. We want to, maybe lift the leaves up off the ground if that's possible, maybe prop them up, or maybe just trim the lower leaves so that there's less access, although the slugs and snails are still going to climb. We want to maybe switch to drip irrigation during the non-rainy season when we have irrigation on. If we've got sprinklers, a lot of times that's going to be spraying the plant parts, which make them really moist and cool during the evening. And if we can switch to drip, we're able to localize that drip irrigation and only water the root zones and avoid excess water in other areas. And then something else that is to consider is avoiding planting plants that slugs and snails really love. Now, this might not be possible. I personally grow a lot of food, so I've got a lot of slugs and snails enjoying some of my food crops right now. So, but we just want to be aware. I know which plants that the slugs and snails are going to enjoy more than others. So I'm going to monitor and pay attention to those to make sure the population doesn't get too out of hand. And things that we can do to reduce the slugs and snails is we're going to put on our gardening gloves and we're just going to hand pick them off. We can even knock them into a little bucket of water, or we can put them in a bucket that is empty and then feed it to the chickens or ducks later if we have that. I know that's a nice tasty treat for those animals that we might have on our properties. There are really great tools like creating a snail board, which is actually just fence boards with a couple like 1x2 risers underneath holding those fence boards together. Understand that slugs and snails are kind of like vampires. They do not like the sunlight. So when that sun comes up, if they cannot take cover inside the plants or underneath the lip of a raised bed or a pot, they will crawl underneath that snail board and hide out in the cool shade of the snail board. And then what you can do is lift that snail board up during the middle of the day and just scrape all those slugs and snails off, gross, into that bucket of water. And that's a great way to reduce those populations. Beer traps are also going to be effective. And then there's tools like the copper tape barrier. There's a couple of different brands that make this, but slugs and snails will not cross that copper. They actually get kind of like an electric shock. And we can now wrap that copper around our potted plants, or we can make a barrier, actually cut the bottom off of a plastic pot and slip that sleeve of that plastic pot, because now it's a tube over the plant to protect it. and put that copper tape around. So now we have a barrier to prevent slugs and snails from crawling up and accessing the plant. And then there's also, I understand that slugs and snails are not able to cross chunky wood mulch. Now, I do use chunky wood mulch in a lot of the garden beds, and I will share that I do not see a lot of slug and snail activity in my garden beds with ornamentals. However, in my food crop beds, I do see more activity, but my mulch is rice straw, so they can easily cross that. Now, an eco-friendly pesticide that we can apply are snail and slug baits that contain iron phosphate. Sluggo is one of the popular brands that we see on the market. However, when it's raining outside, understand that Sluggo will just dissolve and melt. So we want to avoid using these products during the rainy season. And also if we have overhead sprinklers, understand that's kind of defeating it. So we'll adjust that irrigation, not use Sluggo during the rainy season, wait till things dry out, and we can utilize the copper tape and the snail boards. Earwigs and roly-polies or sow bugs. Okay, so I have a lot of earwigs in my garden. Actually, I have a lot of roly-polies too. So these are going to be problematic pests. I mean, they also are beneficial. They're decomposers. They're doing a lot of work in the soil. However, they're also eating my leaves of a lot of my precious plants, and they're also eating a lot of the food crops like strawberries and so forth. I'm not friends with them. So what are some solutions? Well, we can reduce the moisture. So similar to slugs and snails, specifically those earwigs, those roly-polies, they really like that cool, moist soil. So what we can do is, some of the water districts recommend that we water in the evening, sometimes 8 p.m. to 8 a.m. But through the lens of pest management, we are going to suggest that we water early in the morning at those sunrise hours. This is going to then allow that water to evaporate and, the plant areas of the plants to dry out before the evening comes. And this is going to significantly reduce slugs, snails, earwigs, and the pill bugs. Another thing we can do is use that beer trap that we talked about. That's going to be excellent for slugs and snails as well as those sow bugs or pill bugs. But for earwigs, I'm going to use a slightly different trap. Instead of putting beer inside my container, I am going to put a little bit of water, a couple drops of dish detergent, and a couple drops of something that smells fishy. So it could be fish sauce. It could be a little bit of like oil or water from a tuna can or sardines. Charlotte, you had a vegan suggestion. What was that vegan suggestion that was attractive for the earwigs?
I don't remember. Maybe like a kelp meal type thing. I don't remember what
Oh, maybe fish emulsion. I think we came up with fish emulsion as it's not vegan, but it was just a fertilizer. So you don't have to buy something if that's not something you cook with. Anyway, but for earwigs, I'm going to have the lid. I'm going to put that lid back on that container, that deli container. And I crudely cut holes in it that's about the diameter of a pencil, but then I sink it. I sink that earwig trap so that the lid is at the soil surface so that they can just crawl in and jump right in. Very effective. Okay, it is surprisingly effective. But for pesticides, if we want to use products out there, we can absolutely use diatomaceous earth and make a barrier around the plants. As long as the earwigs are not up inside the plant, or the slugs and snails, if they're up in the plant, they're not going to crawl down. So as long as they're not in the plant, we're going to make a barrier with diatomaceous earth. But again, if we're using overhead watering, if it's raining, that diatomaceous earth turns into kind of a paste and not as effective. That diatomaceous earth, we are relying on that chalk-like substance to cling onto the exoskeletons of the insects and dehydrate them. But then there's also baits that we can use that are very effective for earwigs, pill bugs, as well as slugs and snails. That's going to be that iron phosphate blended with another active ingredient, spinosad. And now this is going to be in a very effective bait that's more broad spectrum and safe to use around food crops. All right, citrus leaf miner. I feel like we are right around the corner from citrus leaf miner season. As soon as things get warm, I'd say what, at least by May, we are going to see a lot of citrus leaf miner activity. So citrus leaf miner is a pretty little moth. She's very tiny. She's only about 1/4 of an inch long, and she's kind of fuzzy. She is going to lay her eggs on the back of the leaves of citrus, the new growth. So the new leaves that have not hardened off, that are still lighter green, they're still succulent and soft and able for the larvae. So those eggs hatch, then the larvae is going to burrow into that leaf, right in between the two layers of the leaf, and start to mine, so to speak, and enjoy all of those plant juices and those plant sugars. Okay, so one thing we can understand is that if we are feeding our citrus with a lot of high nitrogen or synthetic fertilizers, like the fertilizers that have those higher numbers, like 16, 16, 16 or similar, we are going to be stimulating a lot of new growth, which is going to be very attractive to the citrus leaf miner. I can also share that when we do not have beneficial insects present, we are going to have lack of predators. We won't be able to compete. There will be the citrus leaf miner has no competition. But understand that this is really more of a aesthetic problem. It is only affecting the leaves and not the fruit, not this leaf miner. So some damage is tolerated. So what are some means for, what are some solutions? Well, we're going to reduce the stress of that plant. We're going to monitor the new growth for the eggs. We're going to look and see if those eggs are on the back of the leaves, and we can just wipe them off. We are going to hang sticky traps. There's a citrus leaf miner trap by Monterey Lawn and Garden, and I believe Pest Wizard might have one as well that you'll see commonly around the garden centers. And these are going to be excellent monitoring devices. These are going to help us monitor when there is the adult activity, so that we can then, go and inspect leaves even more closely. And then we want to selectively prune, because if we're pruning frequently, we're stimulating new growth. And we've already determined that that new growth is what's so attractive to the adult. She's always going to lay her eggs on that new growth. And then we want to invite beneficial insects. Predatory wasps could be present. You can also purchase these beneficial insects at Sloat and other garden centers around. Sloat does bring them in, and you can learn more about them at the Sloat Garden Centers. But we want to, I'll be talking a little bit more about how we attract them is by planting a diversity of flowering plants that are tiny flowers such as Sweet Alyssum, Cosmos, letting our cilantro, parsley, and dill go to flower, planting Nepeta or other similar plants around the area. Yarrow is another great thing. Chamomile, anything that is clusters of little flowers or that are small or medium-sized daisy or sunflower-like flowers. These are all going to be really nice to integrate and intercrop around these plants that might be prone to some of these pest problems, because it's inviting in those beneficial insects. Some eco solutions that we can use that are pesticides. Well, there are some really great products on the market. Spinosad is the active ingredient. This is the liquid form. Unlike the baits we were just looking at, which is a granular form, this is a liquid form that we are spraying onto the leaves. We are spraying it in a way that pests can ingest it. So it's really designed for insects with chewing mouth parts that want to ingest that pesticide. And when we're using spinosad in liquid form, we're going to read that label, and we're going to see that we're limited to only 6 applications a year. So when we use this product, we want to be very strategic with the spray schedule. And then there's other products, horticultural oils, such as mineral oil, neem oil, organicide, which is a sesame oil, and so forth. And these are going to also act as suffocants to suffocate those eggs and make the areas less desirable for the adult. Leafminer for vegetables is a different insect. This is actually a fly. There's a couple different leaf miner. Well, there's several different types of leaf miners, but we're just focusing on the two that we get asked about often throughout the Bay Area. So the vegetable leaf miner is commonly seen on chard, beets, and spinach. I would say chard is probably the most common. And a couple things to keep in mind is that, again, similar to the citrus leaf miner, the fly is going to lay its eggs onto the leaf of these plants, always that tender new growth. And then those eggs are going to hatch. That larvae is going to burrow between the layers of the leaves. You can literally see the larva between the layers of the leaves because the leaves become very transparent. So both on the citrus and on these vegetable leaves. So if you're brave enough, you can actually just squish them. I usually just cut that section of the leaf off and cut it because I can't, squishing it kind of freaks me out. But, if you're brave, you can handle it that way. But understand that these food crops that the vegetable leaf miner show up on is typically when the temperatures start to warm up. So these are really cooler season crops. And when the temperatures start to warm is when we start to see this vegetable leaf miner activity. And I can also share that the larvae is going to overwinter in the soil. So that's something to keep in mind. Because when we're looking at vegetable leaf miner solutions, well, we are going to identify those eggs. There's a picture of the eggs on the leaf. They literally look like little grains of rice, and we can just scrape them off with our fingernail, no big deal. If we've never had leaf miner in that area or in that soil that is in that planting bed, and we're planting one of those food crops for the very first time, we can use row cover because that row cover is going to prevent that fly from coming in and laying eggs on the leaves. These are leafy greens. They do not need pollinators to create the food that we want to eat. So it's a great way to use the row cover. However, if we are lifting that row cover off and having it removed off that bed for the majority of the day while we're gardening and cleaning and futzing around the garden, then there's a possibility that that fly can come in and lay its eggs. So working with the blue sticky traps, these are the Thrips and Leafminer sticky traps. They're very effective, and it starts to identify when there's activity. When we see activity is when we want to actually start combing through and removing those eggs and then squishing any larvae that got that we overlooked eggs and they actually got to that form. It's very important to rotate our annual food crops because that larva is going to stay in that soil, overwinter in the soil. And a really great way to break that life cycle, if we know we've had the vegetable leaf miner, is actually apply beneficial nematodes to the soil. I would say once the soil temperatures start to warm up slightly, like in the coming weeks, excellent time to apply those beneficial nematodes because they will actually eat any of that larvae that's overwintering. And thrips. Thrips are very challenging pests throughout the Bay Area. And I'm sorry if any of you are faced with them because I feel like sometimes they're getting even more challenging to manage. However, it is possible. So thrips are common for a lot of like rhododendrons, azaleas, myoporum, roses. I personally am faced with thrips on my roses, especially the lighter colored ones. But a couple things to keep in mind is that the life cycle. The life cycle is really important with this. Well, first we're going to identify, working with the sticky traps to help us identify the pests is always going to be really great. We're going to see the silvering kind of damage, almost stippling, but it's like very slow. The leaves become kind of silver because they're literally sucking the pigment, the juices out of the leaves, and it makes the leaves look very silvered is the best way we can describe it. And then you can also see some of their frass, the little poops are going to be peppered on the leaf. That could also be an indicator. But thrips are interesting. The adult will lay an egg on the plant with it may be tucked into the leaf. The eggs are very difficult to see. Then they are going to hatch, and we're going to have two pre-pupa. The first and second instar of the larvae is actually going to be feeding on those plant juices, feeding on the new growth of those leaves, all those syrupy, delicious sugars that are in those leaf cells. And then they're going to drop down for instar 3 and 4, which are the more proper pupa stage, although this illustration says pre-pupa and then pupa. I've seen it listed differently in other, but it doesn't matter. It's still, we've got 2 stages of larvae that are going to be in the soil, feeding off of the organisms, the leaf litter in the soil. So that's something that's really important to understand. And then they're going to emerge as an adult. So some solutions for thrips is this one is going to be when we have thrips out of nowhere, this just show up like the plants were fine for years and years and years. And now all of a sudden we have thrips activity. It's usually going to be an indicator that something is happening. And typically it's going to be irrigation. Either the irrigation is broken and that area is super dry, maybe a critter chewed it, or that there is a new area that's been planted and it's getting regular irrigation, staying too wet, maybe impacting the root zones of those established plants. Or maybe we are, using a lot of synthetic fertilizers. But I have found that typically it's an irrigation problem or planting the wrong plant in the wrong place. That's something else that can definitely attract thrips. So a couple things we want to do is definitely increase the biodiversity in the area to attract beneficial predators. That is really going to help us out a lot. And we are going to avoid those synthetic fertilizers, and we really want to check that irrigation, and we want to protect that soil with a nice 2 inches of mulch, and then make sure that soil is drying out slightly between watering. These are all really important tools. We are going to avoid plants that are prone to thrips. So if we happen to love, rhododendrons, but they just get totally annihilated with the thrips in my garden, I'm just going to avoid planting them. I'm going to enjoy them at the botanical garden or in someone else's garden. If we're growing annual food crops, we definitely want to make sure we're rotating those food crops, because again, those thrips are staying in the soil at some point of their life cycle, and they're going to, affect any annual food crops that might be prone to thrips. We're going to use those blue sticky traps as monitoring devices. We're going to remove and secure damaged leaves. And what that means is we're going to prune out any leaves that are damaged. We're going to put them in a paper bag, seal that paper bag, just roll it up, and then get it into the green waste bin. We do the same thing with citrus Leafminer. If we're removing leaves that are infected, we want to make sure we put it in the bag. And the reason why is because if there is any any phase of the larvae, they can actually pupate within a day or two. And if we haven't emptied the green waste bin and we open up that lid, they can just fly out and go and land on another plant. I apologize. It was the citrus Leafminer, vegetable Leafminer, and thrips. So all of them. So these are just things to keep in mind. We definitely can inoculate the soils with those beneficial nematodes when they're in that soil stage. And some eco pesticides. We're going to use that spinosad because it's very effective for thrips. But remember, we're limited to 6 applications a year. And then working with a neem oil can also be really helpful, as well as organocide. Those are going to be helpful either in conjunction with the spinosad, alternating, or on their own. Okay, spider mites. This is a lot of information for everybody. Spider mites. Okay, so spider mites, there's definitely plants that are very prone to get spider mites. Oftentimes it's our house plants, it's buddleias, it's the brugmansia or daturas, it's gardenias, English ivies. There's just a lot of plants that are prone to it. So let's already know what's prone and then be aware, and we're going to monitor. But things that can increase spider mites is going to be poor air circulation. Spider mites really like that dry, cozy, warm environments with really no air circulation. Feeding with a lot of synthetic fertilizers is also going to favor spider mites. And when we've had spider mites in the past and we're using broad spectrum synthetic pesticides, understand that that can actually increase the populations of spider mites. It's really strange. But spider mites are really strong and they're survivors and they don't want to die. And so what happens is when we're spraying a broad spectrum pesticide, and this actually can also go for neem and a pyrethrin product as well. That is a botanical. The spider mites are going to disperse and we are going to see them show up in other areas of the plant. So really we want to avoid using those broad spectrum pesticides. Lack of predators is also going to be a reason why we see an abundance of spider mites. So yes, let's try to increase the biodiversity of plant material and attract more beneficial insects. But we can also make sure we're irrigating properly. We want to increase the air circulation, the airflow. You can go ahead, Charlotte. Thank you. We are going to monitor for the pest problems because we're going to understand which plants are prone to spider mites. But then as we've experienced, last summer was very hot and dry. We had some significant heat extremes. We saw more spider mites popping up on plants that typically don't get spider mites. So we just want to be aware and just, look at our plants a little bit more closely and, reach out to the experts at our local garden centers when questions come up. We can easily wipe off those spider mites or syringe with a spray bottle of water with a strong stream. And we want to encourage everyone to feed organically whenever possible, because it just really is a more sustainable way to feed the plants and it provides overall long-term better health and growth for those plants. If we are going to use a pesticide, we are going to use something narrow spectrum, which means something that's going to only have a short list of pests that it kills, which is something like insecticidal soap. Insecticidal soap used in accordance to the instructions on the label is an excellent way to manage those spider mites, but we want to make sure we're getting in all the nooks and crannies, that we're covering the leaves top and bottom, and then working with oils such as the organicide, horticultural oils, neem, and then products like pyrethrin and canola oil, which is Takedown by Monterey is a common brand that has that nice combo. But really, we just want to sometimes just remove that plant. If it's really impacted, we want to remove it. And then also for our annual food crops, we want to rotate those crops. So tomatoes are prone to getting spider mites. So we want to make sure if we've had spider mites on our tomatoes, let's try to rotate those crops, increase the health of that soil, and increase the biodiversity of flowering plants to attract beneficials. Flea beetles can be really problematic for a lot of us. I certainly have them. They are very, very tiny, sometimes hard to identify. They do jump around like fleas, thus the name flea beetle. They chew little holes in leaves and rarely on the fruit. So are we eating the leaves of that plant? If we're not, then it's more of a nuisance, but it's not necessarily problematic because it's not affecting the fruiting parts that we might ingest, such as tomatoes. They will also overwinter on plant parts or in the soil, so it's important to rotate those crops and to be really clean when we're cleaning up our gardens. Sanitation is key, so be very diligent. We are going to also use row cover. If we've never had this problem in the past, it's really a nice way to prevent them. But if that food crop needs to get pollinated, the row cover might not be helpful. Keep covering the soil either with ground covers that are going to be flowering like thyme or sweet alyssum, or using mulch such as straw. Can reduce the eggs that they might lay, but then we want to make sure we're removing that straw mulch at time of harvest, so that we're not leaving any eggs around. And then I mentioned intercropping, and then applying beneficial nematodes to the soil is definitely going to help because it will feed on any of the larval stages or eggs that are overwintering in the soil. And then if we're going to use a pesticide, though it's not as effective, I would just share it's not going to be as effective, but pyrethrin, something that contains pyrethrins which is a botanical pesticide, will be helpful. But I think working with the other cultural controls and practices will be more effective. Cucumber beetles, their diabricas and so forth, are going to be problematic when those temperatures start to get warmer. They are tiny, not to be confused with lady beetles. They are going to again be feeding on the leaves, on the petals and so forth. So we are going to understand which plants they go for. We are going to adjust our irrigations because they certainly like the moisture. We are going to water in the morning to allow the areas to dry out. We're going to mow and manage weedy areas to reduce their hiding places. We're going to definitely inoculate the soils with beneficial nematodes in the spring because those larvae are going to overwinter in the soils. That's a great way to break the life cycle. We are going to practice crop rotation on our annual food crops. We are going to practice sanitation and clean up any plant debris to reduce overwintering pests. We can use row cover, but again, sometimes it's not going to be as effective if we need to get those pollinators in, especially if it's on our flowering. I get cucumber beetles on my dahlias and other flowering plants, which row cover just isn't the point. It isn't going to be as helpful. But the next slide, please. This is the best way to manage them. Okay, so cucumber beetles by default, when they see you coming, are going to drop because they know you're trying to kill them. So if we have a little bucket of soapy water underneath them, they're going to drop right into that bucket. It is also a great way, next slide, please, way to handle a lot of other beetles and weevils and so forth. Just knock them into that soapy bucket of water. It is going to be the best way to manage them. Okay. Charlotte, sorry, I took maybe longer than I was supposed to, but that was a lot of information. Oh
okay, that was a lot of information. So thank you for getting through it. We have a few more pests for you, so hopefully you're still here. So mosquitoes are kind of year-round now, even though it has been kind of cold. We still kind of get them in the winter as well in this environment. So just remember the male mosquito is a pollinator, so there are some benefits to it, but the female, and it's the female one that seeks the blood meal and can bite you. Remembering when we're trying to deal with mosquitoes, they lay their eggs in water, and they can live in a single teaspoon of water. So when we're going around the house, the yard, looking for spots where mosquitoes could be coming from, we're looking for leaves that have collected a little bit of irrigation. We're looking for like even the smallest little areas, from like big things, like tires and debris and pots and like the little saucers underneath pots, but also even just like some yard debris that has collected irrigation or rain. So again, we want to inspect our yards throughout the year for standing water, and drain as much as we can. We'll secure our rain barrel lids to prevent access, or add a screen to them so that they can't fly in and lay their eggs there. If we do have, standing water on purpose on our properties, horse troughs, bird baths, ponds, things like that, we can use products called, there's mosquito dunks, mosquito bits are the common brands, but they're using a bacteria, BT bacteria thuringiensis israeliensis, that very specific bacteria. Those can be dropped into that water and it will kill the larva. But again, we're going to also employ the mechanical controls, placing screens in the windows and doors, wearing protective clothing. If we're going to spend some time outside, maybe we'll put an eco-friendly repellent on our skin, or use some sort of eco-friendly fogger. Sometimes even just like a fan in the area can help prevent the mosquitoes flying in. And then fungus gnats. Fungus gnats are can be harmful to our plants. They can sometimes feed on plant roots. Mostly they feed on organic matter, and then when they hatch as adults, they fly around, and they're kind of a nuisance. They're just a nuisance really in our homes, especially when they're hatching out of our house plants. We don't really want little gnats flying around, but they're usually, if you're seeing little gnats like flying around your house plants, it's usually a fungus gnat, and they like the damp organic matter that's in the potting soil. So some things that we can do to prevent them is to make sure we're not overwatering, and we're letting our soil dry out between waterings, because that dry soil will prevent them from thriving. We can, if we do have an infestation, we can change up the watering. We can consider replacing the soil with new soil, or consider a soil-less planting medium for indoor plants. Certain ones can thrive in soil-less planting medium. We can use sticky traps to kind of monitor and reduce them, and we can also apply a few things to the soil to kill the larvae before they hatch and become adults. The beneficial nematodes, again, a very specific species, can be watered into those house plants or outdoor plants. And then the BT, the mosquito bits that I was just mentioning on the previous slide for mosquitoes, actually can be used to manage fungus gnat larvae as well. It's not going to manage the adults when they're flying around, but it will prevent future generations of fungus gnats to hatch. Then we have fungal diseases. There's a lot of different fungal diseases, but some common ones that we'll talk about are black spot, rust, and powdery mildew. Black spot and rust are very common, especially on rose plants and apple trees, things like that. They're very common in general, and they thrive in cooler, wetter climates and areas. And powdery mildew actually likes warmer, drier conditions. So kind of a weird way to manage both fungal diseases, but they like different environments. So things that we can do, always, of course, focusing on the health of the plant, because healthy plants can survive some fungal diseases. So if we focus on the health of the plant, fungal disease is not going to bring it down. We can always avoid overhead watering. We just focus on the either drip irrigation, soaker hoses. If we're hand watering, we're just going to gently water the soil and not get water on the leaves. And we're going to ensure that the plant has good airflow, so that we can prune it to open it up, increase the airflow within the leaves. That will also reduce those fungal diseases. And of course, if we see them damage on the leaves, we're going to remove those leaves and get them off site. Don't put them in your compost pile. Now, as I mentioned, powdery mildew is a little different. It actually likes drier conditions. So one simple thing we can do for powdery mildew is washing it off with water. But I just said no overhead watering. So how do we do that? We can either very gently take a wipe, if we have the ability or the time, we can wipe it off with a damp towel. We can gently rinse it off with a spray bottle or a hose, but really gently. And then we want to do that in the morning so that the plant will dry out throughout the day. And then at nighttime, it'll be drier for when it gets cooler, and it won't invite those other fungal diseases as well. And then there are several options for eco-fungicides. Sulfur, copper soap, neem oil can be effective, and a bacteria strain. Do read the label when you are using, especially sulfur does not mix well with certain other pesticides. Not that we should be mixing pesticides to begin with, but if we're spraying like a horticultural oil on a plant, we do not want to use a sulfur as well. So always reading the label and spraying with caution. Then we're going to move on to our bigger critters here, our bigger pests. So we have rats in the garden. Rats are really hard to deal with. They live outside. We've created great environments for them. We have food everywhere. We have places for them to hide. I've definitely heard that they've kind of boomed throughout the pandemic, and it's becoming a real problem. It is a real problem. So things that we can do to minimize the rats in the garden. We live in a somewhat urban or suburban environment. It's going to be hard to eradicate rats from the yard, but so kind of having understanding our threshold and changing the environment. So we use our cultural controls to reduce the pest population in our own properties. We remove places where they can hide, remove places of harborage, so dense brush, ivy, wood piles, debris piles, places where they will nest. We're going to clean those up. And then we're going to remove as much access to food as possible. I know this is not possible, especially if we have fruit trees, or our neighbors have fruit trees, but we don't, and our neighbors are free feeding their animals and we're not. We can only do so much, but we're gonna secure our compost bins, our chicken coops, our garbage bins, prevent them from coming in. We're going to reduce the pet food availability, either not free feeding them or securing the pet food storage. Maybe consider not having a bird feeder if you're having a rat issue, because they really love that, like fallen seeds on the ground. And then remove any other food sources. So if you have a veggie garden, there's a nice buffet for your rats. Unfortunately, unfortunately, the best way to manage rats and keep them out of your veggie garden is to build an exclusion cage or frame. So that picture on the bottom right is a very fancy custom kind of frame for these raised beds, but they can be quite beautiful. They can be very accessible, but you can also make one that's, not quite as custom and fancy, but anything that uses the 1/4-inch hardware cloth and will securely keep rats out of the veggie garden is pretty much the best way to manage them outside, in addition to the other cultural controls that we talked about. For gophers, if you don't have gophers, you will get them eventually. Everyone in the Bay Area unfortunately has them. Gophers are very challenging. First, identify, is it a gopher or a mole or maybe a vole? Gophers eat plant material. Moles will have more shallow tunnels and they eat worms and insects and stuff in the ground, but the gophers are the ones that really cause a lot of damage to plant. They eat plant roots, and they create these big crescent-shaped mounds. Prevention is the best way to deal with gophers. If we're putting new plants in the ground, we should always use gopher baskets, gopher wire, or use 1/2-inch hardware cloth to create some sort of barrier around the root system. If we're putting in raised beds, we want to line it all the way up the side, like that picture on the bottom right, to make sure that the gophers cannot come in. We're always going to monitor for activity. If we see, we'll see their activity pretty quickly. They have these big mounds. You can use traps to eliminate them. There are a lot of different kinds of traps. Some are a little bit more intimidating than others, but they can be quite effective to get rid of some gophers in the yard with some patience and diligence. And then there are some repellents that can be effective as well. Ones that are made from castor oil do repel moles and gophers. This Momax is one option for that. Make sure if you do choose that route, read the label, because it's not about just dumping it all over the place and expecting the gophers to leave. You're using the repellent to push the gophers out of your yard. So there are instructions on how you can do that. And then other critters in the garden, as we mentioned, exclusion frames, but there's other fencing, baskets, things that we can use. If we are trying to keep rats, mice, and voles out, we're going to use 1/4-inch hardware cloth. Gophers, as I mentioned, can use 1/2-inch hardware cloth, and hardware cloth is just a wire mesh, and it comes on a roll. It's kind of like poultry wire, but a little more sturdy and the smaller gauge. For squirrels and rabbits, to keep them out, we can use 3/4-inch or poultry wire. And then if we have deer, we want to use at least 7-foot tall fencing to keep deer away. And some more pictures of these exclusion frames that I'm talking about. They can be walk-in size. They can be perfectly fitted to your small beds. They can be in a lot of different shapes and sizes, but they are going to be very effective for keeping a lot of different pests out. And then some other barriers. I know that there are other critters out there that dig a lot in the garden, cats or raccoons, for example. We can use barriers to deter them. You know, there's cat scat mats that kind of have like pointy things that come up. They don't hurt the cats, but they're unpleasant. So you could lay that down where you're seeing cats digging. Of course, always if we have a problem with cats in the neighborhood, find out, you know, maybe if there's a neighbor feeding them, or I know it's hard to deal with neighbors sometimes, but find out if there's a way we can keep them inside, or to, you know, reduce their population in that area, especially if they're feral. But cat scat mats can be deterrents. You can cut them up and place them around your plants. And then also bird netting or poultry wire can be used also. It just prevents them from digging, because you lay it down on either the lawn or the soil surface. You could do it underneath the mulch, and it deters them from digging, and that goes for raccoons as well.
So we have two pests that we want to bring to your attention. The Asian citrusilla that has been in California for a number of years now. You might see information at the local garden centers. If you're buying citrus, they'll be tagged. This is a psyllid, which is an insect that has a sucking mouth part that's going to suck the juices out of the new growth of the plant. It is very, very tiny. Something to understand, it is smaller than an aphid. So I believe that it could be mistaken as an aphid at first sight, but the remarkable feature is that the nymphs have these little white waxy curlicues that they secrete. So that's really going to be the identifying factor. The Asian citrusilla does spread a disease, Long Being disease or citrus greening disease. It does mottle the leaves of the plant, making the leaves kind of this blotchy yellowing kind of effect. However, not to be confused with nutrient deficiency. So if you do have some yellowing leaf and it's even, that's going to most likely be a nutrient deficiency. If it's blotchy yellow mottled, then and it's not the same on both sides, and that's most likely the citrus greening disease. However, that's going to happen years later after it has been affected by the Asian citrus psyllid. Regardless, if you happen to think that you have Asian citrus psyllid any at all, you're going to call the CDFA hotline immediately, and this is the phone number here on the page, which I'm sure Sloat Garden Center, every single Sloat has this information at their garden center. So you can also just reach out to them and ask them, who do I call? How do I call? And the next pest is going to be our spotted lanternfly. Now, this is not in the state of California yet, and we want to prevent it from being in the state of California. So spotted lanternfly is in 11 states of the United States. We are going to, it is pretty, it is really pretty. The pictures on the information, the multicolored fly, it is an invasive pest that has many hosts. It is really going to enjoy grapes and stone fruit trees as well as other plants. But since we're in California and grapes and stone fruits are a big deal for us, we want to prevent this from coming into the state. So we're always going to detect. So if by any means you happen to see this pest at all, please call the CDFA hotline. Again, the phone number is here on the screen. You can go to the website, cdfa.ca.gov, or reach out to Sloat because they're going to have this information for you as well. And we're almost done.
We're almost done. A couple more slides. All right, so just to wrap up, we talked about a lot of different cultural, mechanical, biological controls, but we just want to review chemical controls and provide some tips for you. And the big thing that we want to take away, hopefully you've heard us say this a few times tonight, is that pesticides won't solve the problem if we don't address why the pest is there, the conditions that are stressing the plant out, or the gaping hole in your garage door that's inviting rats in, or the chicken coop next door that's inviting rats in. Then pesticides are not going to are not going to solve the problem. We need to know why the pest is there. Pesticides will temporarily kill a pest. but they might also kill beneficial insects as well and harm the environment. So when we use pesticides, we're always using them as a last resort. We've tried the other cultural, mechanical, biological controls. We still want to go for a pesticide, that's fine. We're going to use the less toxic and most eco-friendly product out there, which we have shared several options for you. We're going to apply according to the label always. We're reading the label. I say read the label before you buy it in the store. Make sure the pest that you have is on that label. Understand how to use it. Ask your garden center, the associates, if they have any tips, and then maybe it'll be the right fit for you. We're always going to wear our PPE, our long sleeves, long pants, face covering, and we're going to understand the risks and unintended consequences to ourselves, to the environment, to other critters out in the environment as well. A couple more tips. We are going to know the pest, as I mentioned, and only target that pest. We're going to spot treat. I think I mentioned this later, but we're going to spot treat. We're only spraying where the pest is when the pest is present. With like thrips and spider mites, it's easy to see like the silvering leaves, and then we start spraying something, but those pests they're really hard to see. They might have been long gone and we just saw the leaf damage now. So again, we want to make sure that the pest is present before we spray, and we're only going to target that pest when we're spraying that pesticide. We understand the pest life cycle. We'll be able to understand when the application is most effective. Some of these, we want to understand also how the product works, because some products are suffocants. They act as suffocating the insect. So maybe for like the citrus Leafminer, it's only going to work on the egg form and not the larval form that's inside and protected by the leaf layer. Some products need to be consumed by the pest, and some products just need to come in contact with the pest, like a physical contact. So we need to understand the active ingredient and how it works, and that will help us best apply it the right time of the life cycle. Again, we're spot treating. We're only targeting that one pest. We're going to apply pesticides at dusk. This is because beneficial insects are less active at dusk. And then also some pesticides burn the leaves of the plant when we apply them in sunlight. So to avoid that leaf burn, we will apply later in the evening. Some pesticides also break down in the presence of sunlight, so we don't want to, if we're spraying that pesticide, we want to make sure that it actually has time to work. We're also going to avoid applying when plants are in bloom. Some of these pesticides can kill beneficial insects or deter beneficial insects, including pollinators. So we want to make sure that we are not going to harm those pollinators coming to that plant. We're going to apply in temperatures only less than 85 degrees because, again, we don't want to burn the plant, and some products are more sensitive to heat as well. We want to avoid applying pesticides to water-stressed plants. Those plants can be more sensitive to pesticides and we can just harm the plant by spraying the pesticide. And always when there's no breeze or when rain is not forecasted for several days, that is when we can apply a pesticide, because we want that pesticide to stay exactly where we're aiming it, where we want it to be. We want it to stay on the plant and not get washed away, to work as effectively as we can. And if we are going for releasing beneficials, then we want to definitely hold back on pesticides for several days, if not longer, to allow the beneficials to find the pests and do their work on the pests. We just go right in there with a pesticide, we might kill the pest and then there's no food for the beneficials, or we might kill or harm the beneficial insect. Thank you for sticking around this long. It's a lot of information. That's why we record it. So you can learn more about specific pests at the Our Water, Our World website. We have all of our fact sheets and information about chemicals and pesticides. We have the UC IPM website, which is an amazing website. I go there frequently. You can learn about different pests, different plants, and what pests are common for them. So you can read about your plant that you just bought and be prepared for any pests that might come in, and lots of information there. Bugguide.net, great way to learn about different bugs, and the National Pesticide Information Center, great way to learn about active ingredients and how they work and what risks they might pose. Thanks again to Jen and Sloat for having us tonight, and thanks for everyone for being here.
Oh my gosh, thank you so much. So much valuable information. I know it's a lot, but to your point, it's recorded. You can go back, rewatch, screenshot, and everything, because this is really important information going into the season, and they covered all the bugs that you might be able to possibly see. So thank you, Suzanne and Charlotte. It's later on Wednesday night, so we have a couple more questions, but I'll just ask that people email me if you have additional questions, just so we can get to making dinner, whatever we're gonna do. What?
You can email us too. We have
Yeah.
And you can, oh yeah, and their information is right there too. And so you can go directly to the source. And I really appreciate everything that you have to share. And we were talking before the class that it's raining and everything now, but guaranteed as soon as this rain stops, all these bugs are going to just like instantly appear in the garden. And so you have the tools now and the knowledge, and I appreciate that, Suzanne and Charlotte. So thank you, everyone. Have a wonderful evening. Hope to see you at the next class.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.